Okay, here we go. Today's lecture is on the Spanish, Dutch, and French in colonial North America. As all of you know, most of what we're going to be studying in the colonial period are the 13 English colonies that are founded starting in the early 17th century, but it's important for American history and for current culture to understand some of the deep influences of these other European countries, cultures in American history. So we'll start with the Spanish, and most of you are pretty familiar with the outlines of Spanish colonization. Certainly after reading chapters 1 and 2 of the textbook, especially chapter 2, you have some sense of how after Columbus landed in the islands of the West Indies in 1492, other Spaniards were quick to make the crossing and begin contact with the Native Americans and begin to basically exploit the New World for everything it was worth to the Spaniards. When Cortez gets to Mexico in 1519 and travels from the coast to Mexico City, he brought with him about 320 soldiers and an absolute certainty that what he was doing was religiously sanctioned and moral. And he brought with him a number of Native American allies who were interested in Cortez's project of clearly weakening the Aztec leadership that was emanating out of Mexico City. Upon that kind of shocking conquest by 1521, Cortez initiated a policy of colonial control over the Native American population that sought to preserve as much of the Aztec bureaucracy as was possible, to replace the very top of Aztec hierarchy with Spanish officers like himself, and to then control the masses through the Aztec Empire for the explicit benefit of the Spaniards. And the Spaniards fairly quickly found out that there weren't a lot of ways to make a lot of money. The only really profitable agricultural enterprise was cattle raising and turning the skins into hides, and the leather trade basically that came out of Mexico for the next 150 years was profitable, but very labor intensive. Much easier for the Spaniards was to enslave the Native Americans and have them either turn over the gold and silver that they had stored or mine more silver as they discovered in the silver mines of Mexico. And you can see there one of the major mines there. And of course, the book talked about Pizarro in Peru and these incredible amounts of silver, which were exported from New Spain starting in about 1525 or so and peaking in the 3 decades between 1580 and 1610. We'll get back to that. As the Spaniards began to institutionalize their control over their vast colonial holdings, and you can see it all here in brown, that goldish piece of Brazil here are the Portuguese claims. The encomienda labor system was codified to try to give political control to the Spaniards that were dominating the local regions around Mexico, and gave them both political authority and social mechanisms to control the labor population, which was exceptionally exploitive and obviously quite deadly to Native Americans. The encomienda system was replaced about 40 years after its introduction by the repartimento system, which was meant to try to make it a more humane labor system, but which ended up still being exceptionally exploitive to Native American laborers. It did, however, limit the number of days that Native Americans could be enslaved to 45 per year, which I think is very touching. Okay, so as you all know, the Spanish filled their galleons, their ships, as to the brim with silver and gold. Some of ships, as you know, sank on the high seas and in the West Indies, and pirates seized some of them, but a lot of the silver and gold made it back to Spain, where the Spanish squandered this unbelievable quantity of wealth, mostly on anti-Protestant wars in the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants between about 1540 and 1648. The Spanish were the principal financial source of the Catholic effort to wipe out Protestantism in Europe. And rather than investing the wealth that they had stolen from the Americas, or rebuilding their merchant marine, or using the wealth to fund future growth, they squandered their wealth on paying mercenary soldiers in this unsuccessful crusade to re-Catholicize Europe. And by 1648, Spain was on the way to being a second-rate power in European power politics. Most of the energy and interest from Spain was centered on Mexico and the countries of Central America and the western half of South America, which, as you know, still contain an incredible Roman Catholic Spanish culture, deeply embedded in the DNA of those societies. The settlement in the very northernmost regions of the Spanish colonies were in Florida. At St. Augustine was the earliest settlement there, and in New Mexico, in Santa Fe. They got to Santa Fe the same year, 1607, that the English established their first permanent colony at Jamestown. And it's of interest to note that the Spanish did not get to the California, Alta California, the present-day state of California, until very late in the game. 1769 was the first Spanish mission established in San Diego. And over the next 20 years, the Spanish had been in California, sailing past and claiming it in the 1500s, but they don't really get up to settle until after 1769 and building about 20 missions up and down the coast here, connected in theory by El Camino Real, the King's Highway. And I think what's kind of most interesting about that is how very late in the game, that by 1769, the British colonies have almost 2 million people residing there, and the Spanish are just beginning to land in California. Now, the Dutch were in America early on. Just skipping down to this map real quickly here. The Swedes were here too, where the Delaware River comes out between Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey. The Swedes were here for, about 5 years, and they tried to found a colony, New Sweden, in the 17th century, and it did not take, but they did contribute to American culture by introducing the log cabin to housing structure on the East Coast. So the Swedes gave us that. The Dutch gave us other things like religious tolerance and an interest in trading. The Dutch based their claims on the voyages of Henry Hudson, who sailed, in this case, for the Dutch and found this harbor here at what is now New York City, which he called New Amsterdam. And the New Netherlands was basically this north-south strip of farmland, very rich farmland, in the Hudson River Valley. They were present and during the period of kind of the 50 years of Dutch sovereignty, the Dutch power peaking about 1650. The Dutch were the strongest economic power in Europe for most of the mid 17th century, and part of that was their holdings in New Netherlands. They also were at that point trading with the Japanese on Nagasaki Island. They had a colony in South America. They had a colony in South Africa. And they were moving in on the Portuguese in the Dutch East Indies in what eventually we'll call Indonesia. So the Dutch are all over the world, and in New York, what used to be New Netherlands, they practiced what they were already preaching in, or not preaching, in Amsterdam, and that was religious tolerance. So the first Christian Western European country to not burn you for which version of Christianity you practiced. So that tolerance brought a lot of refugees and a lot of different kinds of people to Dutch settlements all over the world, but especially in Holland. And they were, like I say, not interested in what you believed. They were interested in how much money we could make with each other. So trading became embedded in the DNA of the Dutch Empire around the world. There was an interesting kind of unique land distribution scheme here that they came upon in the Hudson River Valley called patroons. A patroonship refers to this landed estate that's in this region, and a patroon may also be the name of that estate or the name of the Dutch wannabe noble or sometimes actual Dutch nobility that came to the New World, that were granted these huge land grants by the Dutch government, and they in turn rented out land to tenant farmers in the Hudson River Valley. And I just mentioned that because that form of tenant farming is unique to this part of the 13 colonies as they evolved in the 17th and 18th centuries. Lots of renters here. They fought a series, the Dutch did, of 3 naval wars with the English in the mid 17th century, and I've got circa here for the dates because the Dutch were kicked out of New York, and then they came back, and then they were kicked out. So I'm just estimating about 1670 of the time of when, by that time, New Netherlands turned into New York, and New Amsterdam into New York City, and they were completely absorbed by the English and the English culture that's going to be emerging in the 17th century and in the middle colonies. Okay. The French, you can see the claims of New France based on their voyages that went up and down the St. Lawrence River Valley here, and there are early settlements of Quebec and Montreal on the St. Lawrence River. And then, of course, in the Great Lakes region, and they were able to also sail down the Mississippi River and claim all of that for their king, King Louis XIV, and called it all Louisiana. So the French have this huge inland empire, Le Canada and Louisiana. And this kind of blue map here shows the lines as being pretty distinct. I'll show you a couple other maps that give you some sense of the French. It's all this green. Basically, all of the land that flows, the waters from all the land that flows into the Mississippi River was what the French claimed to be Louisiana. So in some cases, they're all the way out here in Montana and Wyoming, doing what the French were doing everywhere, wherever they settled or wherever they were in New France, and that was basically fur trapping and trading with the Native Americans. That was the basis of their economy. And that map kind of gives you a better sense of the extent of their claims here, even though most of their settlements and forts and missions were either on the St. Lawrence River or on the Mississippi River Valley. Aha! Let me go to presentation mode just to pretend. That looks better, doesn't it? Okay. And the French sent over Catholics. The Coureurs de Bois are the names of these fur trappers that came. They usually traveled in pairs, young men, one for each end of a canoe as they went up and down these waterways and ponds and rivers and met Native Americans and had comparatively better relations with Native Americans than the English did, because for the most part, the English in their colonies over here are more interested in taking permanently the land from the Native Americans as opposed to working with the Native Americans and establishing trading relations. So that's part of the pattern of New France there, but a very small population. Even though Quebec and Montreal are emerging as urban centers, there's probably only about 45,000 French people that come to New France that are living in New France by 1750. And at that time, in those same years from 1607 to 1750, the English population was probably growing to something about 1.5 million and soon to be 2 million in their 13 colonies here. And not surprisingly, the French and the English, who during the whole colonial period were at war with each other, mostly fighting in Europe, are going to fight a number of wars over who ought to have control over this land here that was, you know, claimed really by the French and the English, but effectively occupied and controlled by the Native Americans. And so it won't be surprising that the 4 wars that are fought between the French and the British in the American colonies are going to eventually decide who's going to dominate North America. And as you'll see soon, the last of those wars, the French and Indian War, will be fought and concluded in 1763 with the British winning. And it's certainly one of the reasons why I'm speaking English to you right now. So that's the lecture. Hope you enjoyed it. I want to end with this thought question for you. What are some of the most enduring influences of Spanish, Dutch, and French colonization in the culture of North America? Be interested in hearing what you have to say about that. Okay, thank you very much.